In Cedar Grove, where autumn leaves dance with forgotten dreams, Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that love and destiny share the same unpredictable heartbeat. A single mother of 3, working 2 jobs, she'd learned to silence her own longing for romance, focusing instead on survival. But fate had other plans. On a rain-swept night when thunder whispered ancient secrets, a distinguished stranger appeared on her porch, his steel-grey eyes holding mysteries deeper than the storm itself. What Sarah couldn't know was that James Harrison carried more than just a rain-soaked briefcase. He held the key to unlocking not just $1 million inheritance, but the carefully guarded chambers of her heart. This isn't just another tale of lost directions found. This is a story of how one stormy night's decision would rewrite not just history, but 2 hearts bound by secrets a century in the making. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That morning had started like any other in Sarah Mitchell's carefully orchestrated world of single motherhood. Dawn painted her modest craftsman house in shades of promise, while unpaid bills scattered across her kitchen table told a different story. Her fingers, elegant despite years of hard work, traced the edges of another final notice as she sipped coffee gone cold from neglect. The mirror in her hallway reflected a woman who had learned to wear dignity like armor. Honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical twist, green eyes that still held sparks of dreams beneath their weariness, and a smile she'd perfected for her children's sake. At 35, Sarah had mastered the art of making just enough look like more than plenty in the eyes of Emma, Jack, and little Mason. Emma, 15 and already showing signs of her mother's quiet strength, helped pack lunches for her brothers. Indeed, tuna sandwiches cut into triangles, apples quartered with care, and cookies saved from yesterday's batch at Mrs. Henderson's bakery, where Sarah picked up weekend shifts. Jack, 12 and serious beyond his years, double-checked everyone's homework at the scratched kitchen table, while 8-year-old Mason chattered about his upcoming science fair project, his enthusiasm a bright counterpoint to the morning's grey reality. "Mom, we're running low on milk again," Emma mentioned softly, her teenage eyes carrying an understanding no child should have to bear. Sarah nodded, mentally rearranging the careful dance of numbers that was their monthly budget. The daycare, where she taught, wouldn't pay for another week, and her evening bookkeeping job at Peterson's Hardware had already been stretched to its advance limit. "We'll manage, sweetheart," Sarah assured her, the words as familiar as her grandmother's old locket hanging at her throat. The silver pendant held only empty spaces where photos should be, a mystery from her past that she'd never had time to unravel. Like so many other questions in her life, it remained unanswered in the rush of daily survival. As she herded her children toward the door, thunder rumbled in the distance, nature's warning of the storm to come. Sarah grabbed an extra umbrella, the one with only one broken spoke, and handed it to Emma. "Share with your brothers," she instructed, pressing quick kisses to foreheads, straightening collars, checking backpacks one last time. She watched them navigate the cracked sidewalk, 3 heads bent together against the rising wind, their shadows merging and separating in the early morning light. In that moment, Sarah felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one that spoke of dreams deferred and love forsaken for the sake of stability. The pile of bills seemed to whisper her name as she turned back to the kitchen. Among them, a new envelope caught her eye. Cream-colored and expensive, it stood out like a rose in a garden of weeds. The return address belonged to Harrison and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. Her heart stuttered as she slid her finger under the flap, unaware that this simple act would set in motion events that would change not just her future, but her understanding of her own past. Outside, the storm clouds gathered, heavy with promises of change, while inside, Sarah Mitchell stood at the crossroads of fate. holding a letter that whispered of secrets long buried and love long lost. Secrets that would soon arrive on her doorstep in the form of a stranger with steel-grey eyes and a rain-soaked suit. The storm arrived with the evening, bringing with it more than just rain and wind. Sarah had just finished helping Mason with his science project, a papier-mâché solar system that had left glitter scattered across their worn dining room table like fallen stars, when the first knock came. Through the rain-streaked window, lightning illuminated a tall figure on her porch. In another life, Sarah might have hesitated longer, might have called a neighbor or pretended not to hear. But something in the way the stranger stood there, dignified despite his rain-soaked state, made her reach for the door handle. "I'm terribly sorry to intrude," he said, his voice carrying cultured tones that seemed to belong in boardrooms rather than on her weathered porch. "My car." He gestured vaguely toward the street where an expensive black sedan sat dead in the growing puddles. Lightning flashed again, and Sarah caught her breath. The stranger was handsome in a way that spoke of old money and quiet power, silver threading, his dark hair at the temples, his face carved with lines that suggested both laughter and worry. But it was his eyes that held her, storm-grey and somehow familiar, as if she'd seen them in a half-remembered dream. "Please come in," Sarah found herself saying, stepping back as he crossed her threshold. Water dripped from his tailored suit onto her faded welcome mat, and she noticed his briefcase, expensive leather gone dark with rain, its brass catches gleaming in her hallway light. "James Harrison," he introduced himself, and something flickered. In Sarah's memory, the cream-colored envelope from that morning still sitting unopened on her kitchen counter. Before she could mention it, a photograph slipped from his briefcase, dancing through the air before settling face up on her floor. The image was old, sepia-toned and cracking at the corners. A woman stood in front of Cedar Grove's Grand Anderson estate, her face hauntingly similar to the one Sarah saw in her mirror each morning. In her hands, she held a locket identical to the one currently resting against Sarah's collarbone. "Oh," James breathed, quickly retrieving the photo, but not before his fingers brushed against hers as she reached for it too. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her palm, up her arm, straight to her startled heart. "Mom!" Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Is someone—" She stopped at the base of the stairs, her teenage eyes taking in the scene with a mixture of curiosity and protective concern. "Mr. Harrison's car broke down," Sarah explained, suddenly aware of how this must look. A stranger in their home, her cheeks flushed, the air between them charged with unspoken questions. "I'm a corporate lawyer," James offered, his smile genuine as he addressed Emma, and apparently a terrible driver in storms. His self-deprecating tone earned a small smile from Emma, though Sarah noticed her daughter's shrewd gaze lingering. On the photograph he'd tucked away, Jack appeared next, Mason trailing behind him, clutching his half-finished Jupiter. The boys' reactions were a study in contrasts, Jack's face settling into the serious mask he'd worn since his father left, while Mason's eyes lit up at the prospect of an adventure. "Are you a secret agent?" Mason asked, earning a chuckle from James that seemed to warm the room, despite the cold rain still beating against their windows. "Just a lawyer with very poor timing," James replied, but something in the way his eyes kept returning to Sarah's locket suggested there was more to his presence than a simple car failure. "Though I must admit, finding myself here tonight feels rather like fate." Sarah felt it then, the weight of destiny settling around them like a warm shawl. Later, she would remember this moment as the pivot point, the instant when her carefully constructed world began its transformation. But for now, she simply smiled and said, "Let me make some tea. You can tell us what brings a corporate lawyer from Harrison and Associates to Cedar Grove on such a stormy night." The look that passed between them held more than surprise at her knowledge of his firm. It held the first spark of something that felt dangerously like hope, or perhaps something even more perilous to a heart that had forgotten how to dream. The kitchen had always been Sarah's sanctuary, but tonight it felt different. Steam rose from the ceramic mugs she'd inherited from her grandmother, curling in the air like question marks as James settled at the worn oak table. The children had reluctantly retreated upstairs, though Sarah could hear their whispered speculations drifting down the stairwell. "Mitchell," James said thoughtfully, warming his hands around the mug. "Your maiden name, I presume? I couldn't help but notice it on your mail." His eyes flickered to the pile of bills she'd hastily tucked away. "Yes," Sarah answered, something in his tone making her pulse quicken. "Though I'm surprised a corporate lawyer would find that interesting." She settled across from him, aware of how the rain's rhythm seemed to match her heartbeat. "Everything about Cedar Grove interests me, Mrs. Mitchell, especially its founding families." From his briefcase, he withdrew a yellowed newspaper clipping. The Cedar Grove Gazette, dated 1923, featured a bold headline: "Anderson Estate Celebrates 50 Years of Legacy." Sarah leaned forward, drawn to a familiar face in one of the photographs. That's my grandmother," she whispered, touching the image of a young woman standing slightly apart from the formally dressed Anderson family. "She worked at the estate for years, but she never talked about it much." "Catherine Mitchell," James supplied, his voice soft with something that might have been reverence. "She was more than just an employee, wasn't she?" Thunder rolled outside as Sarah's fingers instinctively found her grandmother's locket. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, then reached across the table. His fingers brushed hers as he gently opened the locket she'd never managed to unlock. Inside, hidden all these years, was a tiny key. "Your grandmother left something in my father's care before she died," he said. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about the Anderson estate dispute." Sarah's mind raced back to her childhood, to summer afternoons spent at her grandmother's knee. Catherine Mitchell had been a mystery wrapped in dignity. A housekeeper who quoted Shakespeare, who taught Sarah to play piano on the estate's grand Steinway when the family was away, who spoke French under her breath when she thought no one was listening. The way she carried herself, Sarah mused, memories flooding back. Everyone used to say she had such grace, such bearing. Even the Anderson family treated her differently, but I never understood why. Because Catherine Mitchell wasn't just a housekeeper, James said, pulling another document from his briefcase. She was William Anderson's first love, and if these papers prove what I think they will, she was also his wife. The implications hit Sarah like a physical force. William Anderson, Cedar Grove's most prominent historical figure, the man whose descendants still controlled half the town's industry. "That's impossible," she breathed. But even as she spoke, pieces began falling into place. The mystery of her grandmother's education, the way she'd been allowed to keep living in the estate's guest house long after retirement, the trust fund that had appeared to pay for Sarah's college until it mysteriously dried up her sophomore year. The marriage certificate was hidden, James explained, his voice gentle as he watched the revelations play across her face. Along with letters, diaries, and a revised will that was never executed, William's family, my family, buried the truth. When he died unexpectedly in 1925, they forced Catherine to silence with threats and bribes, but she was smarter than they knew. She left a trail, Sarah, a trail that leads directly to you. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating James's face as he added softly, "That's why I'm really here, not because of a broken-down car or a random storm. I've spent 5 years tracking down these documents, trying to right a century-old wrong. When I saw your name, saw your face, you look so much like her, Sarah, the same fire in your eyes." Their gazes locked across the table, and Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. In the silence between thunderclaps, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, smell her lavender perfume, feel the warmth of her hands as she taught Sarah to play Chopin on stolen afternoons. "Why you?" she finally asked. "Why would a Harrison care about exposing Anderson family secrets?" James's smile held a touch of sadness. Because William Anderson was my great-uncle, and I grew up watching his true heir serve coffee to my cousins at family functions. Some wrongs need to be made right, Sarah. Some stories deserve to be told. The storm raged on outside, but in Sarah's kitchen time seemed to stand still. She looked down at the key in her locket, then back at James Harrison's storm-grey eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. Emma's footsteps on the stairs broke the spell that had settled over the kitchen. Sarah quickly wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling, while James discreetly reorganized his documents. "Mom?" Emma paused in the doorway, her young face serious. "I found something in the attic. I think you need to see this." In her hands, she held a dusty leather portfolio, its brass clasps tarnished with age. Sarah recognized it immediately, her grandmother's private papers, supposedly lost in the move after her death. The portfolio that Sarah's mother had searched for frantically before simply giving up, claiming Catherine's silly obsession with the Andersons was better left buried. "Where did you find this?" Sarah asked, reaching for the portfolio with trembling hands. "Behind Grandma Catherine's old trunk. I've been organizing the attic for my history project, remember?" Emma's eyes darted between her mother and James. "There's more up there." Before anyone could respond, the harsh ring of James's cell phone cut through the moment. He checked the screen, his expression darkening. "Excuse me," he murmured, stepping into the hallway. Through the rain, Sarah caught fragments. "Yes, I found her. No, you don't understand. This isn't about the money." Sarah turned her attention to the portfolio, its leather soft and worn beneath her fingers. Inside, she found what appeared to be an original deed to the Anderson estate, dated 1873. But it was the marginal notation that caught her eye, a handwritten amendment in faded ink. "Upon my death, all rights and privileges shall pass to my wife Catherine Mitchell Anderson and her heirs in perpetuity." "Holy shit," Emma whispered, earning a distracted language from her mother. "We're actually related to the Andersons?" James returned, his face grave. "That was Marcus Anderson's lawyer. Apparently, news of my presence in Cedar Grove has already reached the family." He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "They're not happy." "Why do they care after all this time?" Sarah asked, passing him the deed. "The estate must be worth billions," James finished quietly. "The land alone is worth millions, but the real value lies in the mineral rights. There's a reason Cedar Grove survived when other mining towns died out. The Anderson holdings include 3 major veins that were never fully excavated. A loud knock at the front door made them all jump. Through the frosted glass, a figure loomed, broader, more menacing than James had been earlier. "Mrs. Mitchell," a deep voice called. "This is Howard Blackwood, representing the Anderson family. We need to discuss your visitor." Sarah felt. James's hand closed gently around her arm. "Don't," he whispered. "Once they get involved, everything becomes infinitely more complicated." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of his proximity, of the warmth of his hand through her sleeve. In the living room, Mason's planetary mobile cast shifting shadows on the wall, while upstairs she heard Jack's door open and close, her protective son, no doubt listening intently. The knocking came again, more insistent. Sarah made her decision. Moving to the front door, she called out, "I'm sorry, but it's late. Any legal matters can wait until morning." "Mrs. Mitchell," Blackwood's voice held a note of warning, "I strongly advise." "Good night, Mr. Blackwood," she said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. It reminded her of her grandmother, of the way Catherine would sometimes stand in the Anderson estate garden, looking at the main house with a mixture of longing and defiance. When the shadow finally retreated from her door, Sarah turned to find James watching her with undisguised admiration. "You really are her granddaughter," he said softly. Emma cleared her throat. "I'll just take these papers up to my room for safekeeping." She paused at the stairs. "Mom, whatever this is, we're with you. You know that, right? Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. After Emma disappeared upstairs, she faced James. Tell me everything. No more gentle revelations. What exactly are we dealing with? James squared his shoulders, looking more like the high-powered lawyer he was than the rain-soaked stranger from earlier. We're dealing with a family that's built an empire on a buried secret. They won't let it crumble without a fight. He hesitated, then added, but if you're willing to trust me, I think we can finally give your grandmother the justice she deserved. Thunder rumbled again, softer now, like distant applause. In the kitchen, the deed lay on the table between empty teacups, its edges illuminated by lightning, a 150-year-old piece of paper about to turn Cedar Grove upside down. Time seemed to slow in Sarah's kitchen as James carefully extracted a bundle of letters from his briefcase, each one tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear, elegant script flowing across decades of silence. These were found in a hidden compartment in William Anderson's private study, James explained, his voice soft with reverence. The family did a thorough job of erasing Catherine from official records, but they missed these. Sarah's hands trembled as she untied the first ribbon. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the page. My dearest William, the baby kicked today, strong and sure like her father. I know we agreed to keep our marriage secret until after your mother's passing, but each day of hiding grows heavier, the servants whisper, though they try to hide it. Only Mrs. Crawford knows the truth, and she's promised to take our secret to her grave. A baby, Sarah whispered, looking up at James. My mother. He nodded. Your grandmother was already 3 months pregnant when William died. The family's lawyer came to her with an ultimatum: deny the marriage and accept a position as housekeeper with a generous salary, or face ruin. She chose to protect her child, your mother, even if it meant burying her own heart. A floorboard creaked overhead, followed by the soft sound of Emma's door closing. Sarah wondered how much her daughter had overheard, how this revelation would change her understanding of their family's history. But why come forward now? Sarah asked, absently touching her grandmother's locket. Why did you choose to uncover all this? James's storm-grey eyes met hers across the table. Because 6 months ago, I found my father's confession. He was the junior lawyer who delivered that ultimatum to Catherine. It haunted him his entire life. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing Sarah's as he opened another letter. But more than that, I found this. The letter was different from the others, newer, written on legal stationery, dated just 5 years ago. To whom it may concern, my name is Margaret Crawford, and I'm writing this letter in my 97th year. I was a maid at the Anderson estate during the years of 1920–1926, and I bear witness to the legal marriage of William Anderson and Catherine Mitchell. A sharp knock interrupted them, different from Blackwood's demanding presence earlier. This one was quick, anxious. Sarah approached the door cautiously, James close behind her. Through the glass, she saw Jenny Peterson from the hardware store where she worked evenings, her face pinched with worry. Sarah, I just got a call from Howard Blackwood. He's offering to double your bookkeeping hours if you'll meet with him tonight. Said it's urgent about some family business. What's going on? Sarah felt James tense beside her. They're moving fast, he murmured, trying to buy you off before you understand what's really at stake. Tell him I'm not available, Sarah called. Through the door, her voice stronger than she felt. And Jenny, I won't be in tomorrow, family emergency. As Jenny's confused figure retreated into the rain, Sarah turned to find James watching her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You realize they'll only escalate from here. The Andersons didn't maintain their power by being gentle with threats to their legacy. I'm not going to dishonor my grandmother's sacrifice, Sarah replied, surprising herself with her conviction. She protected her child, my mother, at the cost of her own happiness. I owe her the truth. James stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes. Sarah, you should know. I'm not just doing this out of guilt or justice. When I saw your picture in the investigation files, saw your name, He paused, choosing his words carefully. I never expected to find you. To find someone who makes me question everything I thought I knew about family, about loyalty, about a crash from upstairs interrupted whatever he was about to say. Sarah and James raced up the stairs to find Jack standing in Emma's doorway, his face pale. Someone's been in the attic, he said. The trunk, Grandma's trunk, it's been emptied. Out! Emma pushed past him, her eyes wide. Mom, all the papers we found, they're gone. Someone broke in through the attic window. As if in response, a car engine roared to life outside. Sarah rushed to the window just in time to see a black SUV pull away from the curb, its tires throwing up sheets of rain. They're not going to make this easy, James said grimly, pulling out his phone. But they don't know what we still have, and they don't know that this time one of their own is standing against them. Sarah looked at her children, Emma's determined face, Jack's protective stance, even Mason peering anxiously from his bedroom door, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. This was about her grandmother's love, her mother's birthright, and her own children's future. Then we fight, she said simply, reaching for James's hand. In the growing darkness, their fingers intertwined, a gesture as natural as breathing and as significant as a declaration of war. Morning arrived with whispers rather than shouts. Sarah found herself scanning headlines on her phone about a potential scandal at the Anderson estate, while comments flooded local Facebook groups with speculation about the mysterious lawyer seen entering her home the night before. Mom, Emma, stood in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, clutching her phone. Everyone at school is talking about us. Caroline Anderson just posted that we're gold-digging frauds. Her voice cracked slightly. She's been my best friend since 3rd grade. Sarah set down her coffee, heart aching for her daughter. Before she could respond, a firm knock echoed through the house. Through the window, she spotted Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, ringing her. Hands on the porch. Sarah, dear, the older woman burst out as soon as the door opened. I'm so sorry, but with all this talk, the Andersons are major investors in the bakery, you see, and... She thrust an envelope forward. I can't keep you on for weekend shifts anymore. The envelope felt like lead in Sarah's hands. 2 jobs down, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. Her phone buzzed, the daycare center's number flashing on the screen. She let it go to voicemail. Everything all right? James's voice came from behind her, and Sarah turned to find him descending her stairs, jacket slightly rumpled from sleeping on her couch. The sight of him, domestic, concerned, his professional, armor softened by the morning light, made her heart skip despite the chaos swirling around them. They're moving faster than we expected, she said, showing him the envelope, cutting off my income, turning the town against us. James's expression hardened. I've seen this before. Classic Anderson tactics. Isolate the threat, then swoop in with a generous settlement offer. He pulled out his phone, displaying a legal document marked with urgent red flags. They're trying to bury us in paperwork, claiming the original deed was forged. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed. How do we fight this? I can't afford lawyers, and now I don't even have... You have me, James interrupted, kneeling beside her chair. His hand found hers, warm and steady. Sarah, look at me. I've spent my entire career building cases against companies like Anderson Holdings. I know their playbook, and I know how to win. Why? She whispered. Why risk everything, your career, your family connections, for this? James's thumb traced circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. Because 20 years ago, I watched my father drink himself to death, haunted by the guilt of what his firm did to your grandmother. Because I've spent my life building cases against corrupt corporations, trying to balance the scales. And because, he hesitated, eyes searching hers, because from the moment I saw your picture in those files, I knew this case would change. My life. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch, but before she could respond, Jack burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with anger. Mom! They're saying terrible things about Grandma Catherine online. Some anonymous account is posting that she and William Anderson. He couldn't finish. Sarah felt James's hand tighten on hers. They're trying to control the narrative, he said grimly. Make Catherine look like a gold digger who seduced a married man. They're counting on social media to do their dirty work. But we have proof, Emma said from the doorway, her voice stronger now. The letters, the witness statement, which is why they broke in last night, James finished. But they don't know about the digital copies I made, or about the evidence still hidden in the Anderson estate's East Wing. Sarah straightened in her chair. The East Wing? That's been sealed for decades. A smile played at the corners of James's mouth. Not to someone with the original master key. Your grandmother's key, Sarah, the one that's been hanging around your neck all these years. The locket suddenly felt heavier against her collarbone. You mean, that key opens more than just a locket. It opens every door in the original estate, including the private study where William kept his most sensitive documents. James stood, still holding her hand. The question is, are you ready to walk through those doors? Because once we do this, there's no going back. Sarah looked at her children. Emma's determined face, Jack's protective stance, even Mason peering. Around the corner with wide eyes, then back at James. In his grey eyes, she saw not just a brilliant lawyer or a man seeking redemption, but someone who believed in justice, in love. In her. When do we start? She asked, standing to face whatever came next. First, James said, pulling out another document, we need to file this counterclaim. It proves the Andersons knew about William's marriage all along. And then, he smiled, a flash of triumph in his eyes. Then we're going to give Cedar Grove the biggest scandal it's seen in a century. The diary emerged from the bottom of Sarah's closet, wrapped in her grandmother's faded silk scarf. She'd forgotten about it until that moment, when James's mention of William's study triggered the memory. Catherine pressing the small leather-bound book into her 12-year-old hands, saying, "Keep this safe, dear heart. Someday you'll understand." Now, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, while James paced nearby on the phone with his legal team, Sarah opened the diary with trembling fingers. The first entry was dated June 15th, 1920. Dearest William surprised me today with a key to the estate's East Wing. Every lady should have her own sanctuary, he said. If only he knew how my heart races when he's near. How impossible it seems that the master of Anderson Estate could look twice at a mere housekeeper. Sarah? James's voice broke through her reading. He'd ended his call and was watching her with concern. What is it? She held up the diary. More proof, more memories, more... Her voice caught as she turned a page, and a pressed flower fell into her lap. More pieces of a love story everyone tried to bury. James settled beside her on the floor, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact sent warmth through her arm, making it hard to focus on the weathered pages. "May I?" he asked softly. Together, they read Catherine's account of her secret courtship with William, their clandestine marriage performed by a sympathetic priest in a neighboring town, their dreams of announcing everything after his controlling mother's passing. The diary entries grew more desperate after William's death, depicting Catherine's struggle between protecting her unborn child and fighting for her rightful place. November 3rd, 1925. They offered me a choice today. My dignity or my baby's future. William would tell me to fight, to stand proud and claim what's mine. But William isn't here, and this child deserves a chance at life without scandal, without shame. So I will swallow my pride along with my tears. I will accept their terms, but I will also leave a trail, my darling girl. Someday, someone will follow it. A knock at the bedroom door startled them both. Emma stood there, her face pale. "Mom, there's something you need to see." Downstairs, the television was tuned to the local news. A reporter stood outside the Anderson estate while text scrolled beneath, "Breaking. Historical documents suggest Anderson heritage built on lies." The camera cut to Howard Blackwood, the Anderson family lawyer, his smile razor-sharp. "These ridiculous allegations are nothing more than an attempt at extortion by a desperate single mother and a disgraced lawyer with a personal vendetta. We have evidence that James Harrison has been manufacturing false documents for years." "That's not true," James said quietly, but Sarah heard the strain in his voice. When she turned to him, his face was tight with controlled anger. "They're trying to discredit me before we can file our counterclaim." "Can they do that?" Jack asked from his position on the couch. "Just lie on TV?" "They can try," James replied, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair, "but they're getting sloppy, desperate." He turned to Sarah, his grey eyes intense. "We must be closer to the truth than I thought." Sarah studied him, really looked at him. This man who'd walked into her life with secrets and storms, who'd turned her world upside down in less than 24 hours. "They said you were disgraced," she said softly. "What aren't you telling?" "Me," a shadow crossed his face. 5 years ago I brought a case against Anderson Holdings, chemical dumping in low-income neighborhoods. I had evidence, witnesses." He swallowed hard. "Then suddenly my key witness recanted. Documents vanished from my office. The judge threw out the case, and the Bar Association launched an investigation. What happened? They buried me in legal fees, destroyed my reputation at my old firm. But they made one mistake." His voice grew stronger. "They let me keep my license, and they never realized I was just getting started." Sarah felt the weight of choices pressing down on her. Outside, rain began to fall again, as if the weather itself was echoing her uncertainty. "James, if they can do that to you, what will they do to us? To my children?" Before he could answer, her phone buzzed. An unknown number, but she recognized the area code, her ex-husband's. The text was brief. "We need to talk about the kids. This media circus isn't safe for them." Emma, reading over her shoulder, stiffened. "He can't take us away. He can't." James stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Sarah," he said softly, "if you want to stop this, I understand. I can try to negotiate a settlement, get them to leave you alone." She looked down at her grandmother's diary, at the pressed flower still lying delicate and fragile on her lap. Then at her children. Emma's fierce determination, Jack's quiet strength, Mason's innocent trust. Finally at James, whose eyes held not just determination and growing affection, but something that looked remarkably like love. "No," she said firmly. "No more burying the truth. No more shadows and secrets." She stood, squaring her shoulders. "My grandmother chose silence to protect her child, but I'm going to choose truth to protect mine." The smile that broke across James's face was like sunrise after storm. "Then we'll need that key," he said, "because tomorrow morning we're going to walk through the front doors of Anderson Estate and take back what's yours." Dawn painted the Anderson estate in shades of gold and shadow as Sarah's old Honda pulled up to the wrought-iron gates. The mansion loomed before them, its Victorian architecture a testament to old money and older secrets. James's hand found hers across the center console, steady and warm. "Ready?" he asked, his voice soft in the morning quiet. Before Sarah could answer, a sleek black SUV cut across their path, tires crunching on gravel. Howard Blackwood emerged, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the early hour. Behind him, 2 security guards took position at the gates. "Mrs. Mitchell," Blackwood called out, approaching her window. "I have something for you." He extended a crisp white envelope. "The Anderson family is prepared to be generous, despite your unfortunate allegations." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside, a cashier's check bore a number that made her breath catch. Enough to pay off her mortgage, send all 3 kids to college, retire her debts with plenty left over. All we need, Blackwood continued smoothly, is your signature on a few simple documents, a retraction of claims, a non-disclosure agreement. His eyes flickered to James. And, of course, Mr. Harrison's immediate withdrawal from the case. The morning breeze carried the scent of roses from the estate's gardens, the same gardens where her grandmother had taught her the names of flowers in Latin, voice soft with hidden meaning. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Catherine's quiet dignity, her careful teachings about beauty and worth. "Did you make my grandmother a similar offer?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet Blackwood's startled gaze. 30 years of silence for financial security. Mrs. Mitchell. "The answer is no." She handed back the envelope, unopened check inside. "My grandmother's truth is worth more than your hush money." James's grip on her hand tightened as Blackwood's face darkened. "You should consider your position carefully," the lawyer said, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Single mother, mounting debts, an ex-husband who's suddenly very concerned about the children's welfare." He straightened, adjusting his tie. "The Andersons have influenced family court decisions before." Sarah felt rather than saw James tense beside her, but before either could respond, a new voice cut through the morning air. "Is that a threat, Howard?" Marcus Anderson himself stood at the now open gates, his silver hair and tailored suit marking him as clearly as a crown. Sarah had seen him before, of course. Everyone in Cedar Grove knew the Anderson family patriarch by sight, but she'd never noticed until now how much his eyes resembled William's in the old photographs. "Marcus," James said coolly, stepping out. "Of the car. I didn't expect you to grace us with your presence. When my security team reported your approach, I thought it best to handle this personally." Marcus's gaze fixed on Sarah as she joined James. "You look remarkably like her, you know, Catherine. She had that same fire in her eyes." "You knew her?" Sarah couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "I was 12 when she left the estate. Old enough to remember the whispers, the tears, the way my father raged against his brother's foolishness in falling for a servant." His lips curved in what might have been regret. "Old enough to watch a good woman sacrifice everything for her child." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we should discuss this in private." "No, Howard, I've watched this family bury its sins for 3 generations. Marcus straightened, every inch the business titan he was. "Mrs. Mitchell, my lawyers, inform me you have William's original key to the East Wing." Sarah's hand went to her grandmother's locket. "Yes." "Then use it." He gestured to the mansion. "The truth's waited long enough, don't you think?" A threatening letter from the Anderson legal team fluttered from Blackwood's briefcase, caught by the morning wind. Sarah watched it dance across the gravel, as insubstantial as the threats it contained. In that moment, with James beside her and her grandmother's key burning against her skin, she felt something shift in the air, like history itself, holding its breath. "Uncle Marcus," James said quietly, "you know what this could mean for the family?" "I do." Marcus's eyes never left Sarah's face. "But I'm tired of living with ghosts, James." As the lawyers left, Sarah turned to James. "What video were you talking about?" His eyes held a mix of triumph and tenderness. "The one we're about to find in William's study. The one that's going to remind everyone that sometimes the price of truth," he reached for her hand, twining their fingers together, "is worth every penny." With only minutes left before security would arrive, Sarah and James hurried back to William's study. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the antique carpet, and Sarah was acutely aware of James's presence behind her as she unlocked the door one final time. "We have to hurry," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "But there's something I need to tell you first." She turned, finding herself mere inches from him in the doorway. His storm-grey eyes held an intensity that made her heart race. "James, when I first took this case," he said, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, "I thought it was about justice, about righting an old wrong. His fingers lingered against her skin. "I never expected to find you." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed a warning, but time seemed to slow in the space between them. Sarah could see the flecks of blue in his eyes, the slight silvering at his temples, the way his expression softened when he looked at her. "Sarah Mitchell," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "You're not just William Anderson's heir. You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. And watching you fight for your grandmother's truth, seeing how you protect your children, the way you've faced every challenge." He drew a shaky breath. "I'm falling in love with you." Before she could respond, a noise from William's desk caught their attention. Emma stood there, tears streaming down her face, an ancient leather portfolio in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know we're supposed to be looking for the video, but I found Grandma Catherine's original will. Mum, you need to see this." The portfolio contained not just Catherine's will, but William's original one as well, dated just days before his death. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the beautiful, devastating truth. They had been married in secret, but legally. William had changed his will, leaving everything to Catherine and their unborn child. And Catherine, years later, had documented everything, protecting the truth for future generations. James's arm slipped around Sarah's waist, supporting her as the magnitude of the discovery washed over her. The warmth of his touch, the solid strength of him beside her, felt like an anchor in a storm. "This changes everything," Emma said, wiping her eyes. "They can't fight this, can they?" "No," James replied, his voice soft but certain. "This is exactly what we needed. Your great-grandmother was brilliant, Emma. She knew someday someone would come looking." Security's footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing closer. Sarah turned in James's arms, looking up at the man who'd risked everything to help her uncover the truth. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, and kissed him. The kiss was everything a first kiss should be, tender and passionate, sweet and promising. His hand cupped her cheek as though she were precious, while hers gripped his lapel, pulling him closer. For one perfect moment, the world outside ceased to exist. Emma's delighted gasp broke them apart, just as the security team reached the doorway. But James kept his arm around Sarah, a silent declaration to everyone present. "Mrs. Mitchell," the head of security said, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Anderson, the board has ordered—" "It's fine," Sarah said, holding up the portfolio. "We found what we came for." She looked at James, seeing her own joy reflected in his eyes. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't in locked rooms or hidden vaults. Sometimes they're in the hearts brave enough to keep believing in love. As they walked out of Anderson Estate, Sarah held her head high, her grandmother's will in one hand, James's hand in the other, and Emma beaming beside them. This was what victory felt like. This was what love could build from the ashes of old secrets. "What happens now?" Emma asked as they reached the cars. James pulled Sarah closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now we show the world that true love doesn't just survive time." He smiled down at Sarah. "It gets stronger with every generation." Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of James's downtown office, turning his silver-streaked hair to gold as he pored over William Anderson's will. Sarah watched him from the leather sofa, marveling at how natural it felt to be here, how right it seemed to face this battle together. "You're staring," he said without looking up, a smile playing at his lips. At her side, James radiated quiet confidence, while Emma, Jack, and Mason clustered close behind them. The children had insisted on being present for the final hearing that would officially recognize their heritage. Judge Eleanor Martinez's preliminary ruling lay in Sarah's briefcase, a document that had arrived at dawn, its contents sending ripples through Cedar Grove's legal community. Upon review of the extensive evidence presented, including DNA verification, historical documentation, and witness testimony, this court finds compelling cause to proceed with the formal recognition of Catherine Mitchell's marriage to William Anderson and the subsequent inheritance rights of their descendants. "Ready?" James murmured, his hand warm against the small of her back. Before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Sarah, wait!" Howard Blackwood hurried up the steps, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "There's something you need to see before we go in." He thrust a tablet into her hands, displaying security footage from Anderson Estate, time-stamped just hours ago. The video showed Richard Anderson in the estate's east wing, but instead of destruction, he was carefully placing something on Catherine's old desk, a leather portfolio and a handwritten note. "He asked me to give you this," Blackwood said softly, handing Sarah an envelope. Inside, Richard's elegant handwriting filled a single page. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell, in my father's study, I found these original stock certificates issued to Catherine Mitchell Anderson in 1925. She never cashed them, never claimed what was rightfully hers, all to protect her child, your mother. I've spent my life defending a lie because I thought I was protecting a legacy. But the real legacy of Anderson Holdings isn't in its stock prices or mineral rights. It's in the love story that built it, the truth that survived generations, and the courage it took to bring that truth to light. My actions in the archive room were unforgivable, but perhaps this small act of restitution can begin to make amends. The certificates are now worth approximately $50 million. They've always belonged to your family. It's time they came home. With sincere regret and hope for the future, Richard Anderson." Sarah looked up to find James watching her intently, his storm-grey eyes full of emotion. "Did you know about this?" He shook his head. "Richard made this choice on his own. Sometimes the truth has a way of changing hearts, even when we least expect it." "Mom," Mason tugged at her sleeve, "is this happy crying or sad crying?" She laughed, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Happy crying, sweetheart, very happy." "Mrs. Mitchell?" A court clerk appeared at the doors. "Judge Martinez is ready." The main courtroom was packed, but Sarah barely noticed the crowd. Her focus was on the judge's bench, where a small display had been set up. On it sat 3 items: Catherine's locket, William's pocket watch, and their original marriage certificate, preserved against time and denial. "Before we begin," Judge Martinez said, her voice carrying through the hushed room, "I want to address something unusual about this case." She lifted a piece of paper. "I received this letter 30 years ago, from Catherine Mitchell herself. She asked that it be filed away, to be opened only if her story ever came to light." Sarah's heart stopped as the judge began to read. "Your Honor, by the time this letter is read, I may no longer be here to tell my own story, but somewhere out there, my granddaughter carries my truth in her blood and my love in her heart. When she finds her way to your courtroom, and I believe with all my soul that she will, please tell her this: true love doesn't just survive time. It grows stronger with each generation that chooses to believe in it. William and I chose love over fortune, truth over safety. We lost our chance at forever, but we gained something more precious, a legacy of courage that I pray will live on in those who come after us. To my granddaughter, if you're hearing these words, you are the answer to a lifetime of prayers. You are the future we dreamed of, the truth we protected, the love we believed in, and to whoever stands beside her in your courtroom, love her with the same fierce devotion that William showed me. Protect not just her rights, but her heart, for in loving her you love not just one woman, but generations of hope and courage, with eternal faith in love and justice. Catherine Mitchell Anderson." In the profound silence that followed, Sarah felt James's hand find hers, their fingers intertwined as naturally as their hearts had, a gesture that would have made Catherine proud. Judge Martinez looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Shall we proceed with making official what love has known all along?" The moment Judge Martinez picked up her gavel, the courtroom doors burst open. Sarah's ex-husband David strode in, his expensive suit and smug expression suggesting he thought he held all the cards. "Your Honor," he announced, "I contest these proceedings on behalf of my children's interests." James was on his feet instantly, his protective stance matching the thunder in his eyes. But before he could speak, Emma stood up. "No," she said, her voice ringing through the stunned courtroom. "You don't get to do this. Not now. Not ever." Sarah watched her daughter, so much of Catherine's strength shining through as she pulled out her phone and approached the bench. "Your Honor, I have something you need to see." The video she played showed David in a hidden meeting with Richard Anderson the night before, discussing price points for disrupting the hearing. The footage was crystal clear, the audio damning. "Just cause enough chaos to delay the ruling," Richard had said, passing an envelope. "The longer we can keep this out of the papers, the more time we have to protect company interests." For this amount, David had laughed. "I'll do more than delay. I'll make sure those kids never see the inside of Anderson Estate." The courtroom erupted. Judge Martinez's gavel crack echoed like gunfire. "Mr. Mitchell approached the bench," but David was already backing toward the door. He never made it. Marcus Anderson himself stood blocking the exit, 2 police officers at his side, attempting to interfere with a court proceeding, Marcus said coldly. "Adding that to conspiracy and accepting bribes, I believe that's enough for an arrest warrant, officers." As David was led away in handcuffs, Sarah felt James's arms slip around her waist. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Your Honor." Howard Blackwood stood, his voice heavy with emotion. "There's one more piece of evidence the court should see." He gestured, and the doors opened again. 2 museum conservators carefully wheeled in a covered painting. With reverent hands, they removed the cloth, revealing a portrait that drew gasps from the assembled crowd. It showed Catherine and William on their wedding day, painted in secret and hidden away for nearly a century. They stood in the Anderson estate garden, young and radiant with love. William's hand rested protectively over Catherine's stomach, where their child, Sarah's mother, was just beginning to grow. "This was found concealed behind a false wall in William's study," Blackwood explained. "Along with this." He held up a gilded frame containing what appeared to be a simple piece of paper. But as he read it aloud, Sarah's heart stopped. "I, William Anderson, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare that should any harm or interference befall my beloved wife Catherine or our child, my entire fortune is to be immediately transferred to the Cedar Grove Children's Hospital Foundation, rendering all other claims null and void. Love must be protected at all costs. Dated June 15th, 1925. The implications hit like a thunderbolt. William hadn't just loved Catherine. He'd created the ultimate protection for her and their child. Any attempt to deny their rights would have resulted in the entire Anderson fortune going to charity. "He outsmarted them all," James whispered, awe in his voice. "Even from beyond the grave, he was protecting your family." Judge Martinez removed her glasses, wiping tears from her eyes. "I believe we've seen more than enough evidence. Mrs. Mitchell." "Sarah, please stand." Sarah rose, supported by James on one side and her children on the other. Through the courtroom windows, sunlight suddenly burst through the clouds, illuminating the portrait of her grandparents as if by divine intervention. "By the power vested in me by the state," Judge Martinez's voice rang with emotion, "I hereby officially recognize the legal marriage of William and Catherine Anderson and confirm their rightful heir, Sarah Mitchell, as the true owner of all Anderson holdings, properties, and assets." The gavel fell with finality, but Sarah barely heard it. She was lost in James's kiss, deep, passionate, and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, she saw her children beaming, Marcus Anderson nodding in approval, and even Howard Blackwood discreetly wiping his eyes. "I love you," James murmured against her hair. "You and your incredible family legacy." Sarah touched her grandmother's locket, feeling the weight of history and hope it contained. "Our legacy now," she corrected him softly. "All of it. Through tears of joy, she looked up at her grandparents' portrait, at the love that had started it all, and whispered, "Aren't you?" The east wing of Anderson Estate held its breath as Sarah's grandmother's key slid into the lock. Decades of silence broke with a single click, and the heavy oak door swung open on surprisingly well-oiled hinges. "Someone's been here," James murmured, his hand protectively at the small of Sarah's back. "Recently." The morning light filtered through dust-streaked windows, illuminating a corridor that seemed frozen in time. Victorian wallpaper, faded but intact, told stories of garden parties and whispered secrets. A delicate side table still held a crystal, a vase, long since emptied of flowers, but waiting faithfully for its next bouquet. "This was William's private sanctuary," Marcus explained, following them inside. "After his death, my father ordered it sealed, said it was too painful to deal with. His brother's belongings." His lips twisted. "Now I wonder if he was protecting more than just memories." Sarah's fingers traced the wainscoting, feeling the smooth wood beneath years of dust. "My grandmother used to describe this hallway to me. The pattern in the wallpaper, the exact shade of the curtains." Her voice caught. "She remembered everything." "Of course she did," Marcus said softly. "This was where they fell in love." The study door stood at the end of the hall, its brass handle gleaming dully in the morning light. Sarah's key worked. Here too, though the lock resisted slightly before yielding, inside time had stood still. Heavy curtains, drawn against decades of sunlight, had preserved the room like a tomb. William Anderson's massive desk dominated the space, its surface neat, except for a single folder placed conspicuously in the center. "That wasn't here before," Marcus said sharply, just as James said, "Don't touch it." But Sarah had already reached for the folder. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, modern, crisp, legal letterhead dated just yesterday. DNA test results. "I had them run the tests weeks ago." Howard Blackwood's voice came from the doorway, making them all turn. "Against samples we had from William's preserved hairbrush and other sources." Sarah's eyes scanned the document, her heart pounding. 98% probability, direct lineal descent. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mitchell," Blackwood said, his voice holding an odd mix of resignation and respect. "You are, without question, William Anderson's great-granddaughter." James moved closer to Sarah, his presence steady and warm. "You knew," he said to Blackwood. "You knew, and you still tried to buy her off this morning." "I had my orders." Blackwood straightened his tie. "The board of directors was concerned about the implications." "Damn the board," Marcus snapped. "And damn my father's lies." He turned to Sarah. "The question is, what do you want to do with this information?" Sarah looked around the study, at the life her grandmother had touched and loved, at the heritage that had been stolen from her family. Her fingers found the locket at her throat, warm from her skin and heavy with history. "I want the truth," she said firmly. "All of it. No more secrets, no more shadows. My children deserve to know their real history." She met Marcus's eyes. "And Catherine deserves to have her story told." A noise from the hallway drew their attention. Emma stood there, slightly breathless, her phone in her hand. "Mom, you need to see this." The local news website's headline screamed across her screen, "Anderson heir discovered. DNA proves local bookkeeper's claim." Below was a photo of Sarah and James from that morning, his hand at her back as they entered the estate. "How?" Sarah looked at Blackwood, who actually smiled. "The board wanted to control the narrative," he said. "I simply helped them do so, in my own way." "By leaking the DNA results," James finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You chose a side." "I chose justice," Blackwood corrected. "Also, I'm retiring next month. Seems like the right time to clear my conscience." Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle around them, like dust motes in the morning light. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. The same clock, she realized, that had counted out the minutes of her grandmother's love story. James's and found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of days. "Sarah," he said softly, "this changes everything." She looked up at him, at the way the filtered light caught the silver in his hair and the warmth in his eyes. "No," she replied, squeezing his hand. "This just means we can finally stop fighting shadows and start building something real." Marcus cleared his throat. "The board will meet this afternoon. As acting chairman, I'd like both of you there." He paused, looking around the preserved study. "It's time to open all the doors in this house, don't you think?" The Anderson estate's kitchen hadn't changed much since Catherine's time. Sarah stood at the same window where her grandmother had once peeled apples and harbored secrets, watching as news vans gathered at the gates like vultures circling fresh prey. "Here," James said softly, pressing a cup of coffee into her hands. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with another message from her ex-husband. "The kids shouldn't be exposed to this media. It's circus. I'm filing for emergency custody." "He can't," she whispered, hands trembling around the warm mug. "He hasn't even seen them in 8 months." James took the phone, reading the message with narrowed eyes. "He won't win, but the timing's suspicious." "You think the board?" "Mrs. Mitchell." A maid appeared in the doorway, young, nervous, clutching an iPad. "There's something you should see. It's about your grandmother." The video was grainy, clearly transferred from an old VHS tape. An elderly woman sat in what looked like a nursing home, her white hair neatly styled, her hands folded in her lap. The timestamp showed a date from 15 years ago. "My name is Ruth Crawford," the woman began, her voice quavering but clear. "I served as head housekeeper at Anderson Estate from 1920 to 1956. I'm recording this because I can't die with the truth locked inside me anymore." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, James's hand steady on her shoulder as they watched Ruth describe the secret wedding, the hidden pregnancy, the threats that followed William's death. "Catherine was the strongest woman I ever knew," Ruth continued, tears in her rheumy eyes. "She chose her child over her own happiness. But before she accepted their terms, she made me promise to keep something safe." The camera panned to show a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I've kept my word for 40 years. Now it's time for the truth to come out." The video ended abruptly. Sarah looked up at the maid. "Where did you find this?" "In the estate's security archives. Mr. Blackwood had it digitized this morning." A commotion from the front of the house drew their attention. Through the kitchen door, they could hear Marcus Anderson's voice, rising in anger. "What do you mean? Injunction? On what grounds?" James squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "Stay here," he said, striding toward the noise. But Sarah was already moving, following him into the grand foyer where Marcus faced off against 2 men in expensive suits. "The board has concerns about the legitimacy of the DNA testing," one was saying, his smile sharp as a razor. "Until an independent verification can be conducted, they've frozen all assets and access to estate grounds." "I'm the chairman," Marcus snapped. "We're the chairman," the second man corrected. "The board voted this morning. Until this situation is resolved, you're suspended." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. In less than an hour, they'd gone from triumph to crisis. She looked at James, saw the same realization in his eyes. This was what the Andersons did, how they'd maintained control for generations. They didn't just fight, they annihilated. "Mrs. Mitchell," the first lawyer turned to her all professional courtesy. "The board is prepared to offer you a very generous settlement. For the sake of your children, I suggest you consider it carefully." The threat in his words was clear as crystal. Sarah's hand went to her grandmother's locket, feeling its familiar. "Oh, wait!" Through the window, she could see Emma watching from the garden, phone in hand, documenting everything. "My grandmother," Sarah said quietly, "spent 30 years serving coffee to people who knew she was their equal. She did it to protect her child." She straightened her spine, feeling Catherine's strength flow through her. I won't dishonor her. Sacrifice by backing down now. James moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers in silent support. You should know, he said to the lawyers, that Ruth Crawford's testimony wasn't the only video we found this morning. Sarah looked at him sharply. He gave her the barest of nods, a promise, a partnership, a plan. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises, the second lawyer said coldly. After that, security will escort you out. Marcus Anderson's face was thunderous. This is my family's home. Not anymore. The lawyer's smile was pure ice. Not until this is resolved. Can you blame me? Her response made him raise his head, storm-grey eyes meeting hers with an intensity that still took her breath away. The moment was broken by a gentle knock. Emma entered, carrying James's personal journal, the one he'd kept during his original investigation into the Anderson case 5 years ago. I hope it's okay, she said, holding up the leather-bound book. I found it when I was organizing the evidence files and, Mom, you really need to see this. Sarah moved to the desk, settling beside James as Emma opened the journal to a marked page. The entry was dated 5 years ago. Found the first photo of Catherine Mitchell today. The resemblance to her granddaughter is striking. Same quiet strength. In the eyes, same elegant profile. Sarah Mitchell has no idea she's about to become the center of the biggest legal battle Cedar Grove has ever seen. But looking at her picture, I can't help but think there's something fateful about all this. William Anderson fell in love with a woman who challenged everything his family believed in. Now, 2 generations later, I'm starting to understand exactly how that feels. You knew, Sarah whispered, turning to James. Even back then? He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I knew you existed. Knew you were the key to unraveling everything. But I had no idea. His voice roughened. I had no idea you'd unlock something in me, too. Emma made a sound suspiciously like a happy sigh, but before anyone could speak, Sarah's phone buzzed. The text message made her blood run cold. Found something interesting about your lawyer boyfriend. Board meeting in 30 minutes. Last chance to take the settlement. Attached was a photo. James shaking hands with Howard Blackwood 5 years ago, both men smiling, a check visible between them. James? Sarah's voice wavered. What is this? His face went pale as he looked at the photo. Sarah, I can explain. He was a double agent, Emma interrupted, flipping frantically through the journal. Mom, read this part, please. The entry was dated 1 week after the photo. Blackwood took the bait. He thinks I accepted. Their hush money thinks I'll bury the Anderson evidence forever. What he doesn't know is that every cent of that payoff is going into a trust for Sarah Mitchell and her children when the time finally comes to reveal everything. Some might call it manipulation. I call it justice with interest due. Sarah's hands trembled as she read further. I've spent my career fighting corporations like Anderson Holdings, watching them buy their way out of justice. Not this time. This time I'm playing the long game. Because somewhere in Cedar Grove, a single mother is working 2 jobs. Living in her grandmother's old house, carrying a locket that holds more than just memories. And someday, when all the pieces are in place, I'm going to help her claim everything that should have been hers all along. The trust, James said softly, taking her hands in his. It's worth 10 times what they're offering you now. I've been building it for 5 years, adding every bonus, every settlement, everything I could. Why? Sarah breathed. Why go to such lengths for someone you'd never met? His eyes held hers, full of warmth and certainty, because justice without love is just revenge. And from the moment I saw your picture, saw Catherine's strength in your eyes, I wanted this to be about more than just winning a case. He touched her cheek gently. I wanted it to be about healing the past, all of it. Emma suddenly gasped, staring at her phone. Mom, Mr. Blackwood just sent this. The video showed Howard Blackwood looking directly into the camera from what appeared to be his office. My resignation from Anderson Holdings becomes effective in exactly 20 minutes, he said calmly, which gives me just enough time to submit this to the board. The camera panned to show a stack of documents, decades of falsified records, proof of the cover-up, and most damning of all, evidence of recent attempts to bribe public officials in the custody case against Sarah. Sometimes, Blackwood continued, redemption comes in unexpected ways. Mr. Harrison taught me that. He smiled slightly. The board should know I kept copies of everything. And Sarah Mitchell's story deserves to be told. As the video ended, Sarah looked at James with new understanding. You turned their own lawyer. No, James said softly, pulling her close. Your grandmother's story turned him. I just showed him how to make it right. The office phone buzzed. Mr. Harrison? His secretary's voice was excited. The Anderson board is asking to move the meeting up. They say it's urgent. Sarah straightened in James's embrace, feeling Catherine's strength flowing through her veins. Tell them we'll be right there, she said firmly. Then turning in James's arms, she kissed him, a kiss full of promise and passion, of gratitude and growing love. Emma pretended to cover her eyes, but her smile was radiant. I think Grandma Catherine would approve, she said softly. Of all of it. The security cameras at Anderson Holdings captured everything. On multiple screens in the executive lobby, Sarah watched herself and James arrive, their linked hands a silent declaration. Emma followed, clutching a laptop containing copies of every document they'd discovered. The timestamp blinked. 4:58 p.m. 2 minutes until the board meeting that would change everything. Mrs. Mitchell, a security guard, approached, his expression troubled. There's been a situation in the archive room. The board is requesting everyone's presence there instead. James's hand tightened on hers. What kind of situation? The answer came in the form of smoke, wisping under the archive room's door as they approached. Inside, Marcus Anderson stood amid scattered papers and overturned files, facing down his own son, Richard, who held a lighter dangerously close to a stack of original documents. It ends here, Richard was saying, his handsome face twisted with desperation. Everything grandfather built, everything we are, I won't let some long-lost heir destroy it all. The security footage playing on a wall monitor told the story. Richard, caught in the act of destroying evidence, confronted by his own father. But it was the small detail in the corner of the frame that made Sarah's heart stop. A familiar silver locket, torn from her neck during their earlier exit, dangling from Richard's other hand. That's not yours, Sarah said quietly, stepping forward. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. None of this is yours, Richard. It belongs to the truth. The truth? Richard laughed bitterly. The truth is that this company survives on reputation, on legacy. What do you think happens to thousands of employees when the world learns our founding family's greatest secret? When they discover William Anderson married the help? They'll learn that love matters more than status, James replied, moving to stand beside Sarah. That justice is worth fighting for. Justice? Richard's hand trembled, the lighter flickering. Is that what you call this grand romance you've orchestrated, James? Playing the noble lawyer, seducing the poor single mother, all to what? Ease. Your conscience about your father's role in the original cover-up? Sarah felt James stiffen beside her, but before he could respond, Emma stepped forward, her phone held high. I've been live-streaming this whole conversation, she announced, to every major news outlet that's been camping outside our house. Want to try explaining those documents you're about to burn? Richard's face went pale. The lighter wavered. Son, Marcus said softly, Catherine Mitchell wasn't the help. She was William's wife, the mother of his child, and by every legal and moral right, the true heir to his legacy. He gestured to the scattered papers. These documents prove what we've all known deep down, that our family's success was built on a lie that stops today. It's over, Richard, James added, his voice gentle but firm. But it doesn't have to end in ashes. For a moment the only sound was the gentle hum of the archive room's climate control system. Then Richard's shoulders slumped. The lighter clattered to the floor, followed by Sarah's locket. As security moved in, Sarah retrieved her grandmother's locket, its silver surface warm despite everything. James helped her fasten it back around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. "I need to know," she whispered, turning to face him, "what Richard said about orchestrating this." "Sarah." James cradled her face in his hands, his eyes full of emotion. "I spent 5 years building the case, yes, planning how to expose the truth, how to secure your inheritance, but falling in love with you?" His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "That was the one thing I never planned for, the one thing that changed everything." Emma cleared her throat. Guys? Still live streaming here?" A chuckle rippled through the room, breaking the tension. Marcus Anderson stepped forward, addressing the cameras directly. "On behalf of Anderson Holdings, I want to formally acknowledge Sarah Mitchell as William Anderson's great-granddaughter and rightful heir. The board meeting scheduled for today will instead be an emergency session to begin the process of correcting a century-old injustice." He turned to Sarah, his eyes soft with something like hope. "Your grandmother's portrait should have hung in our boardroom all these years. Will you help us put it where it belongs?" Sarah looked at James, saw her own future reflected in his smile. Then at Emma, whose quiet strength reminded her so much of Catherine. Finally at the scattered papers that held her family's truth. "Yes," she said, "but first I think it's time for my grandmother's story to be told. All of it." The Anderson Holdings boardroom felt different at sunset. Golden light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, warming the mahogany walls and casting long shadows across the faces of board members as they reviewed the final documentation. Sarah sat at the head of the table, James beside her, there, hands clasped beneath the polished surface. "The numbers are staggering," Howard Blackwood said, distributing the last of the financial reports. "The mineral rights alone. Mrs. Mitchell, you're not just inheriting a legacy, you're inheriting an empire." But Sarah's attention was fixed on something else entirely. The empty wall space where portraits of Anderson patriarchs hung in solemn succession. Soon, Catherine's picture would join them, filling a gap no one had noticed until now. Her phone buzzed. Jack's text made her smile. "Mason wants to know if we can have a pool in the mansion. Also, I found more of Grandma Catherine's letters in the attic." "There's one more matter," Marcus Anderson said, sliding a final document across the table. "The board's official statement to the press. We need your approval on the wording." Sarah scanned the carefully crafted paragraphs, feeling James lean in to read over her shoulder. His warmth against her side had become as natural as breathing. "A love story that transcended class barriers," she read aloud. "A testament to the enduring power of truth. It's beautiful, but..." "But," Marcus prompted, "it's missing something." Sarah reached for her grandmother's locket, which now held a tiny photograph, Catherine and William on their secret wedding day, young and radiant with joy. "It's missing her voice." Emma, who had been quietly typing in the corner, looked up. "Mom, I think I can help with that." She connected her laptop to the boardroom's display screen. The video that appeared made Sarah's breath catch. It was Ruth Crawford again, but a different recording. This one showed the elderly housekeeper seated in Catherine's old parlor at the estate, holding a familiar leather-bound book, Catherine's diary, Ruth said, her aged hands trembling as she opened it. "She asked me to read this entry on the day her story finally came to light. My dear friend knew this day would come." Ruth's voice strengthened as she read Catherine's words. "My dearest granddaughter, if you're seeing this, it means you've found your way home. William and I believed that love could bridge any divide, that truth would eventually triumph over prejudice. They tried to bury our story, to reduce our love to scandal and shame, But true love, like truth itself, cannot stay buried forever. The fortune you've inherited is important, yes. But the real treasure is knowing that you come from love. Pure, defiant, unconquerable love. William and I crossed boundaries of class and custom because we believed in a future where such boundaries would mean nothing. That future is in your hands now. Use it wisely. Use it with love. Forever yours, Catherine. The boardroom was silent when the video ended. Sarah felt James's arms slip around her waist, anchoring her as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. That, she said finally, her voice thick with tears, is what the press release needs. Not just the facts and figures, but the heart of the story. Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. We'll incorporate her words. He hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know. The east wing of the estate, where your grandmother lived all those years. The deed was never transferred after William's death. Legally, it's still in Catherine's name. Which means, James said softly, it's been yours all along. Sarah thought of her small house with its peeling paint, of the struggles and sacrifices that had shaped her family's path. Then she thought of Catherine, holding on to hope and truth through decades of silence. The East Wing needs renovation, she said thoughtfully. A place for children to play, for families to grow, for love stories to begin. She turned to James, seeing her future in his smile. Know any good lawyers who might want to help with the paperwork? His kiss was answer enough, witnessed by the assembled board members and the portraits of Anderson patriarchs, soon to be joined by the photograph of a woman who dared to believe that love could change the world. Emma's happy sigh echoed through the boardroom. Grandma Catherine would be so proud, she whispered, just as the setting sun painted the entire room in shades of gold and promise. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when Sarah arrived the next morning. We did it, Grandma. We brought the truth home. 1 year later, the east wing of Anderson Estate bloomed with new life. Sarah stood in what had once been Catherine's parlor, now transformed into a sun-filled family room where Mason's science projects shared space with Jack's basketball trophies and Emma's photography. The sound of laughter drew her to the window. In the garden below, James was attempting to help Mason set up his latest invention, a combination fountain and light display for the upcoming wedding. Their wedding. The thought still made her heart skip. Mom, Emma appeared in the doorway, holding a familiar leather-bound book. I found something you need to see. The final pages of Catherine's diary, which they'd thought empty, had revealed their secrets under the estate conservator's careful work. Invisible ink, preserved for decades, now told one last story. My dearest William, today I watched our granddaughter playing in the garden. She has your eyes and my spirit, and I know that someday she will find her way to the truth. I've laid the breadcrumbs, my love. I've protected our story, and I've come to realize that perhaps we didn't lose our chance at forever after all. We live on in her, in the way she looks at the world with both strength and tenderness, in how she loves fiercely and fights for what's right. Our forever isn't measured in years we shared, but in the legacy of love we created. Until we meet again, your Catherine found you. James's voice was soft behind her. His arms slipped around her waist as he read over her shoulder. The conservator just finished mounting your grandparents' portrait in the main hall. Want to see? The portrait hung exactly where it belonged, between generations of Andersons, bridging past and present. But it was the new family portrait beside it that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Her and James, surrounded by the children, all of them laughing at something Mason had said, just as the photographer clicked the shutter. There's room for more. You know, James murmured in her ear, his hand resting gently on her stomach, where their newest secret was just beginning to show. Mrs. Harrison Mitchell? Marcus appeared in the hallway. The foundation board is ready for your first meeting. As chairwoman, the Catherine Mitchell Anderson Foundation had been Sarah's first act as heir, a charitable organization dedicated to helping single parents and funding education for their children. Its offices occupied the estate's renovated west wing, while the east wing had become the home she'd always dreamed of. "Coming," she said, then turned to James. "Ready to change more lives?" His kiss was gentle, full of promise. "With you, always." Emma made a show of covering her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Grandma Catherine would love this, you know, all of it." Sarah touched the locket that still held the key to so many doors, both literal and metaphorical. Inside, she'd added a tiny photo of her own family alongside the picture of her grandparents. "Love stories never really end," she said softly. "They just grow bigger, generation by generation." As if in response, the garden fountain burst to life, masons carefully, programmed lights dancing in patterns that spelled out happily ever after across the water. Sarah laughed through happy tears, surrounded by the family she'd found and the legacy she'd claimed. In the portrait above them, Catherine and William seemed to smile down at their granddaughter, their love story not just preserved but living, on growing stronger with each new chapter, each new beginning, each new dream come true. Some said it was the biggest scandal Cedar Grove had ever seen, but Sarah knew better. It wasn't a scandal at all. It was simply love, finally setting the truth free.